Welcome as you're all coming in from the waiting room. We love seeing all your faces. So actually would encourage people to, if you're not in the midst of eating dinner, turn on even if you're in the midst of eating dinner, we can take a look at that, see all these wonderful faces as folks are joining us. So that is terrific. Give it a minute, I think, while everybody comes in the room. All right. I'm going to give it another 30 seconds and then I will start promptly here. I think, Kat, you're letting everybody in as they come in at this point. Okay. Terrific. My name is Ellen Tone, and I have the great privilege of being one of the co-founders of MassEnergize, and you're all here tonight because you're either a community that is working with us to accelerate climate change mitigation or adaptation, or because you're a partner of ours, or because you're a loyal donor and supporter. All of you are part of our orbit, and we cannot possibly do the work in front of us without each and every one of you. So we're thrilled to have a very large community that we are working with. Most of you know us, but just a couple of sentences about who we are. Our mission is to provide tools and resources to help those that are working at a community and local level to accelerate climate actions, with a particular focus on households and residential actions, because we know in most of our communities it's the residential households and their transportation that make up the vast majority of greenhouse gas emissions. And all of those residents and households are voters in their own communities, in the state and nationally. So ensuring that they feel that they have an agency and a voice and that they can take actions that will make a difference is really what we are doing. We've grown from working with 5 communities when we first started in 2019 to 22 at this point. And we really feel like we're at a little bit of a tipping point with much, and Gregg's going to talk to us about this, much more interest from individuals, much more recognition of the role of climate change in our lives, paired with big state incentives, state resources, and new federal resources with the IRA to help us all accelerate the change that we need. We like to say that all the communities we're working with have engaged over 10,000 households who have collectively taken over 20,000 actions. That's our best counting. So we feel we are on the path to making the change that's needed. I want to make sure I introduce our core team before I introduce our speakers. So our new executive director, Nathan Scott, can wave over there. Our other core team members, Kat Vanderstraeten, Brad Hubbard Nelson, Steve Bright, Megan Sullivan, Amy Pualka. Who am I missing? Good, Kat, I got it. Okay. So we have 2 wonderful speakers tonight. I'll introduce Dr. Sparkman first, and then we'll hand it over to State Senator Jamie Eldridge. But we are so excited. I'm so excited. And I hope those of you who have met Gregg before will walk away being equally excited as I am to have Gregg join us. We met Gregg when he was first at Princeton. We were thrilled to have him in the Boston area as a professor now at Boston College. We've been following his research on how we can motivate people and policymakers to act on climate and environmental issues. And we always learn with Gregg. He's spoken to our community practice, and I'm sure that you'll find his research of interest in ways that we can better engage and craft new strategies. He is an assistant professor at Boston College in psychology and neuroscience, and the director of the Social Influence and Social Change Lab, which studies motivations to change behavior, policy preferences, and how to advocate for change. His lab collaborates with nonprofits like us, public and private organizations, to develop and assess interventions and campaigns. Gregg has also agreed to be a senior advisor to MassEnergize, so he will be part of our orbit, and we look forward to learning and be where we've done this with Gregg before. There's a little interactive piece, so you're going to have to actually participate a little. So we'll give Gregg some time, and then we'll turn it over to Jamie. We're saving about 25 minutes for questions and answers. If you have questions, please put them in the chat. our team will be looking at those and we'll save them and do all the questions after both speakers have gone. So over to you, Gregg.
Great, thank you. All right, so yes, as mentioned, I'm new faculty at Boston College, new to the area, currently live in Waltham. I managed to both navigate the academic job market and the Boston housing market like in the last year or so somehow. I feel particularly lucky to have managed that. And as mentioned, I'm faculty in the psychology department at Boston College, so you're going to get a little bit of information on the psychology of climate change in this talk. So I'll go ahead and share my screen and then throw the slides up and hide the meeting controls, all the things we've learned how to do second nature at this point, and then swap so that you're seeing the full screen version. Okay, great. I'll go ahead and get started. So I'll be talking a bit about social norms and climate change, and in particular, the value in making invisible things visible in the domain of climate change. So first, as a really brief primer to social norms, this word, I think, kind of entered the mainstream in discussion during COVID and whether people were taking actions or not and the need to change norms. But just to kind of give you a psychologist perspective on this, which is a large part of where that term has come from, the idea is that we might look around and see everybody behaving the same way or holding the same attitude. And we might think, oh, maybe most people do that because it's competent, or maybe because it's important, or maybe because it's enjoyable, or maybe because it's socially approved. Essentially, we think it's got to be the norm for some reason. And that can lead us to a form of self-persuasion where we become more likely to conform to that norm that we see in the world around us. I think everybody understands that there's peer pressure, but the other part I really want to emphasize here is that we also presume there's some wisdom in what norms are and think there's probably a good reason most people do that. And that's also highly influential. So it's not just peer pressure. And in this way, social norms regularly shape our personal beliefs about what's true, good, or socially reputable in the world. This has been leveraged in a variety of applied contexts to promote sustainable behavior and decision-making. So it's been used in interventions to increase people's registration for home energy audits, to improve waste management processes and how people dispose of waste in their homes, to reduce energy and water conservation residentially, to get people to choose more sustainable forms of transit, and to increase rates of voting and also kind of influence what kinds of things people think are good things to vote for. But there is a major hurdle in sustainability that regards norms, and that's that a lot of climate solutions that we might ask people to do actually go against present norms. So for instance, you might try to want to motivate somebody to adopt new technologies, maybe EVs, for instance. Maybe you need them to shift behaviors and habits, like change their peak energy use. Or perhaps you need them to support novel climate policies that they haven't seen before, like the sort of rapid siting of renewables that's going to be necessary to decarbonize the United States. So all of these things essentially are going to be much harder because you're asking people to do something that isn't the norm presently. And so they're going to doubt that it's perhaps a good idea. So one question that motivated a lot of my research, particularly in grad school, was trying to understand, well, how do we motivate actions that actually go against present norms? One approach that I found is that there's actually some norm information that can be used for that purpose. And I've called this dynamic norm information, but it's the idea that we don't just observe what most people do now, we also observe change in others' behaviors over time, or change in others' beliefs over time. So we have perceptions of trends that we're seeing in the world around us. And so even though norms presently might not be good for something, you might find that there's a positive trend you can highlight. And when you do that for people and you draw their attention to positive changes over time, then they're more likely to follow suit, even if that means abandoning the current norm. So if I learn something is up and coming, I might do it even though it means I'm no longer doing the thing that used to be the norm. And you can use this to promote sustainability in a variety of domains. So for example, some of my early research showed that when people learned that more and more people were eating less meat in the United States, that it made them much more likely to be willing to try a plant-based diet. In one specific study, for instance, we had people who were presently at a cafe and they read about this trend, and they became about twice as likely on average to choose a plant-based meal that day for lunch. So in that case, it went from about 1 in 6 people to 1 in 3 people getting a veggie lunch. There's also research that's shown this in a variety of other sustainability domains. Like if you told people that customers are switching from to-go cups to reusable ones, you can kind of reduce waste. Or when people learn that a growing number of Americans are angry about climate inaction, that can actually increase one's own policy support for climate policies. So why is it that dynamic norms lead to change? Well, it turns out that learning that others are changing can help signal a bunch of inferences that resolve really common psychological barriers that might otherwise make change hard. So when I learn people are changing, I might think, oh, even though it's not the norm now, maybe in the future, this actually will be the norm, right? And so I kind of conform to where I think the norm will be, not just where it is right now. Another one is that sometimes people doubt change is possible, but when you learn that others are changing, you think, if others are changing, maybe I can too. And it increases your belief that personal change is possible. Or when you learn that others are changing, it might be a context where you just don't think change is important enough to pursue. And change is not easy. It requires us to defy habit and to defy biases towards the familiar. But if you learn that others are changing, you might think, well, other people seem to think this is worth changing for. So it actually signals that they thought it was important if they were doing it, because people think that change isn't easy. And then finally, there's some domains where people have identity related barriers, like something doesn't sound like it's for people, quote unquote, like me, whatever that means for someone. But when you see people changing, you might think, oh, people like me who didn't do this before are starting to. And so it kind of normalizes the process of people who, like you, didn't do some action before, are commonly starting to do so. So it kind of erodes this variety of barriers that otherwise makes change hard. These are all psychological barriers, right? Of course, there's systemic and structural barriers, but there's an awful lot of just pure psychological ones too that we need to address in order to get change to happen at the pace we'd like to see it. So for instance, how might you use dynamic norms? I've given you a few examples, I'll give you a couple more. Someone might think, I don't know, is buying an electric vehicle really worth that extra cost? And you could provide a dynamic norm statement to try to address this concern. You could say, well, more and more people feel it's worth that upfront cost, right? And you could present them with information about the growth and market share of EVs, for instance. Someone might think, I don't think states like mine are the kind that are going for net zero, right? And they have this idea that states like mine, maybe they're thinking of conservative states or something like that, or ones that aren't necessarily leaders in this space, don't go for net zero. But you could say, well, actually a lot of states, including certain states like Louisiana and the Carolinas, are actually heading in that direction, right? And so you could signal that people like them are changing in that way. And in this way, you can kind of anticipate what kind of barriers people think are the problem and provide them with information that others are changing as social proof that maybe that's actually not as big of a deal as they thought, and actually change is possible or good or worth it, etc. There's a second hurdle to sustainability that I want to talk about that also deals with norms, which is that we don't always have accurate perceptions of what the norms really are. And instead, people don't really conform to what the norm truly is. They only conform to what they perceive it to be. So this is where we're going to get a little interactive. So what I want you to do is we're going to throw up a poll question in a second. It'll have the same text basically as what's here. And there's two questions that you're going to answer. I want you to give your best guess. Don't Google it. Don't search it. Just give your personal estimate of what you think these numbers are. I want you to estimate the percent of Americans. Oh yeah, here you're going to see it right now in front of you. I want you to estimate for the first one, the percent of Americans that at least somewhat agree that citizens should do more to address global warming. So that's the first one. So pick whichever bucket you think the correct answer is. What percent of Americans would say, like at least somewhat agree that citizens should do more to address global warming? And then the second one, similar but a little different. Estimate the percent of Americans who would say they would like at least agree, like somewhat agree that my local official should do more to address global warming. And we'll give you all some time to think, but not search, but think for the answer about this.
And Greg, we're thinking what Americans, not people in my community, just across the United States, right?
Yeah, countrywide, the US of A. What percent of Americans? I think it's probably a good enough amount of time for people to give their estimates. I'm not going to guess, that'll skew things. Okay. So can we reveal the poll answers now?
Yep.
I want to see what you all thought. Okay. So
Did this?
yeah, who I can see it. Can others see it? If not, I'll read it out loud to you.
Yeah, we can see it.
Okay, great. So yeah, if we look at this, we see that most of you all, for this first question, thought it would be, the most popular answer was that somewhere around half, somewhere between 40 and 60% would say that, citizens should do more to address global warming. And then what about my local officials? Yeah, folks guess somewhere in between 40 to 60, but most people guess between 60 and 80 there. All right. So let's take a look. So these questions were polled by the Yale Program on Climate Change Communication. They do so regularly, about every 6 months, and have been doing so for some time. So what percent of Americans believe that at least someone agree that citizens should do more to address global warming? It's 68%. So while some of you were in that 60 to 80 bucket, probably there's more of you who are in that 40 to 60 bucket. So you might have underestimated people's belief that citizens themselves could do more to address global warming. All right, and for the second one, about local officials, 59% of Americans. And so that one, y'all were pretty close on the money. There was a divide between the 60 to 80 and the 40 to 60 buckets. And one thing that's interesting here is that it's a majority in virtually every state except for 3, which you can see on this map highlighted in like the light blue, that fall just below that 50% line. So pretty strong consensus in that kind of national sense. Okay. So there's some research that suggests that people might underestimate how concerned others are about climate change, which would be kind of similar to maybe the first guess that we just took from you all. So we asked a very large representative sample of Americans to estimate the percent of fellow Americans who felt at least somewhat worried about climate change. And we asked them to estimate the percent that would support 4 different climate policies: a carbon tax, citing renewable energy on public land, 100% renewable energy mandate by 2035, and something akin to a Green New Deal. And here's what we found. So these are called violin plots, and they show you a distribution of people's guesses. So this gray blob is like where people guessed on a 100% scale. So the fatter that blob is, the more people guessed there. And the red line are the actual levels from polls using the exact same question wording. So the real levels for how many people are worried about climate change is about 66%. What percent of people say they'd support a carbon tax? You get about 67%. Citing renewable energy on public lands is very popular, closer to 80%. 100% renewable energy mandate by 2035. And Green New Deal will often poll at about 2/3 of Americans. Now, of course, this always depends on the exact phrasing you use in a poll. Here, we're using the same phrasing for both people's personal level and what they think Americans would say. So we're kind of controlling out for language use here. So the crazy thing, though, is that while those numbers are in between 60 and 80%, people are guessing that they're only between 30 and 40%, right? So the density on like this side of this red line is much larger. There's a lot more people who, on average, are thinking, I don't know, somewhere between 25 and 50% of Americans feel this way, when actually it's closer to 2/3, right? And so the percent of people who fall on the side of the line where they're underestimating these things ranges in between like 70 and almost 90% of Americans are underestimating how worried their fellow Americans are about climate change and how much they support fairly transformative policies to do something about it. So one of the crazy things too is that this is near universal across the country. So this is the state, those are those same levels broken down. We oversampled small states so that, we didn't just have 10 people in Wyoming. So we could actually give a confident-ish estimate for each state. And you can see that every state underestimates how much their fellow Americans are concerned about climate change. You can do this same question for how much do you think your own state, not the country, but your own state is worried about climate change, and you find near similar results. So these underestimations about how much people are concerned don't just apply to the national level, they also scale down to the state level. There was one exception, though, when we do it at the state level, which I thought was funny, which is that Vermonters know how concerned Vermonters are about climate change, but everyone else underestimates it. Now, when it comes to policy support, averaging across those 4 policies I showed you, we see that everything gets a bit more red, right? So the underestimation levels are closer to 30% or 20% pretty much everywhere. And states like California and Texas look very similar. States like New York and the Carolinas look pretty similar. So it's like pretty unanimously underestimating how concerned people are and how much they support climate policy. Mississippi is a little bit more off than everybody else, but besides that, people are all almost shoulder to shoulder and underestimating this. So this is what we would call like a full norm inversion, right? So supporters of climate policies outnumber opponents 2 to 1 in this country. but pretty much most, if not all, Americans believe the opposite to be true on average. And this misperception is pretty much universal. So it was robust across the variety of policies we looked at. We see it in every country, region of the country. And we also broke it down by every demographic, and virtually every population had this underestimation by upwards of 20%, enough to flip it from majority to minority opinion. There was no demographic we found that on average was correct, even like directionally correct about which side the majority was. And there's some concerning implications of these nationwide norm misperceptions, right? People who care about climate change and want policies to be passed might think, you know, I kind of feel alone in this. That maybe I care too much. Maybe I'm overreacting, right? It can like soften their support and undermine their sense that this is a real concern, a real problem. It also leads people to feel alone, which is often a non-starter for them coordinating large-scale solutions. And finally, it can thwart democracy if it serves the misperceived will of the people instead of the real one. Okay, now it's time for another poll question. So the first question here is, what percent of Americans report that they discuss global warming at least occasionally? And the second one is, what percent of Americans say that they hear about global warming in the media at least once a week? So could we throw that poll up, please? Thank you. Let you guess. Probably enough time. All right, can we go ahead and share those results for what people guessed? What percent of Americans discuss, and this is again that they're telling you, reporting that they discuss global warming at least occasionally. So there's a wider distribution here, where the average for us is kind of in that middle bucket between 40 and 60%. Some people are more optimistic though, that it's higher, 60 up to even 100% for that first one. And for the second question, how much do they hear about it? At least once a week in the media. People are saying 60, 80%, maybe actually the most popular answer in this case, 80 to 100%. Okay, let's take a look at the real numbers according to the Yale Program on Climate Change and their national surveying they've done. So discuss global warming at least occasionally. We're only getting about 35% of Americans saying they do that across the country. Very universal too, right? Everyone's in the blue here. Everyone's underneath the half mark. Okay, what about hearing about it in media at least once a week? 33%. What? Right? Pretty low. This was as of, I think the most recent one is late 2021. So this is pretty recent too. So I think this gives us sort of an answer as to why is it that people universally underestimate others' concern and policy support, right? They don't hear about it. They don't see people talking about it. They're not talking about it, but they're concerned. We call that a spiral of silence. That's when people are worried, but they're not talking to others about those worries. So this highlights a real important need to help make those attitudes and actions people are taking more visible than they might otherwise be. So most Americans are concerned about climate change and they support solutions, but they probably think they're alone in doing so. And a lot of climate change actions or attitudes are not outwardly visible, right? Like if you change your heat pump for your HVAC system for your house, people probably won't see it. If you change your water heater to a heat pump style one, people probably don't know. There's a lot of things that we do that you can't see necessarily. Or your attitudes, like by definition, they're internal states, right? They're not things that you can obviously witness from somebody just by staring at them, unless they've got, like a bumper sticker or a pin or something like that. So it's really important to do some of the work. This is the shameless plug for MassEnergize, of course. So having ways to make these invisible actions more visible is critical to shifting these norm perceptions, which we know shapes people's own attitudes and behavior. So, simple things like putting signs out when people have switched to green heating, for instance, or if they start buying renewable energy credits, things like that. Those things are otherwise probably pretty invisible. So we need to find ways to make them visible. And you can do this online too. And MassEnergize does that, right? Where they take a town and they will show you from self-report how many people are taking action and completing action. And so it's really critical to kind of get these norm messages on point for folks so they don't feel alone, that they understand that they actually are in the supermajority for these kinds of issues. Okay, great. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Greg. So you can put any questions you have for Greg in the chat, and I will then hand it over to State Senator Jamie Eldridge, who has been a leader on climate change, and we're thrilled. I live in Wayland, so I'm thrilled that he now represents Wayland, in addition to many other communities, primarily in Middlesex, but some also in Worcester County, and he chairs the Senate Clean Energy Caucus. So Jamie, over to you. Just reactions and where you see the legislature going, and then we'll have a spirited discussion. I heard someone say, "Oh, wow," on one of the things, so I know somebody has. So Jamie, I'm curious, was this old news to you, or is some of this, that's interesting.
No, it's really helpful. And to Gregg, thank you so much for the research. And I've talked a lot with the Sunrise movement, folks, a lot of young people about what they're doing to move people, which a lot of that is story based, which I think is very powerful. I think the dynamic norms and making the visible visible, I think those are so key. I just think of whether people are putting up solar or putting in geothermal or buying an electric car is some way, and obviously MassEnergize really plays a role. Is how do we communicate that these actions are happening by our neighbors or by a group. And I do think, sort of related to that, is I think my guess is most of the people here in this meeting are from communities where there's an expectation that their municipal officials, that their legislators are taking action on climate. Is I think that sort of creates a dynamic of competition, community to community, and not to self-reference myself too much, but one of the things that Ellen came to, and my guess is a few other people here, is I reestablished, through the help of my environmental policy advisor, who's in the meeting tonight as well, Immaculate Machomi, the Green Advisory Council, which was an opportunity to have leaders from across the 14 communities that I still represent now, to compare ideas about what people are doing. And I thought it was very positive. So impressed with what Wayland is doing. Very happy to be representing it soon. I'm from Acton, so Acton's also been a real lead. And you get into this dynamic now where I work with Sudbury to get some state funding alongside Representative Gentile and Senator Barrett to allow Sudbury to hire a sustainability manager. And I think part of that was, well, wait a second, Acton has a sustainability manager. Obviously, Wayland does. Why doesn't Sudbury? I think what I would add, as far as Gregg's presentation, which is sort of related to a bill that's being discussed by HEAT that we might end up filing, is the neighbor to neighbor comparison. Is that looking at, can we make public everyone's energy use, their utility bills, how much energy is being used, so that well, wait a second, my neighbor is using 3 times as much energy, or my neighbor is using a quarter. Why is that? What are we doing to make our home more energy efficient? So that's just one bill idea. And then I think the last thing I would say, just reflecting on Gregg's presentation, is which a lot of people have talked to me about, is what is the state doing to educate communities, and beyond the making the invisible visible, all of the options about what communities' actions can be taken at the local level. So I do think that education piece, I think it's a lot to expect every community to sort of step up immediately to provide information to residents about what they can do. Really, in EEA, there should be sort of an education component or program that's educating people about what does the next generation roadmap mean for every community, about what they should be doing. All the Inflation Reduction Act and bipartisan infrastructural federal money, how can communities gain access to that and really gain a hope that we can really tackle this problem at the local and obviously the state level. So those are some of my quick reactions, but very, very helpful, and appreciate Gregg's presentation. I'm
Thanks.
happy to talk about legislation too, if you'd like.
Yeah, I mean, is there, you mentioned the neighbor to neighbor bill. Is there any other piece of legislation that you think will, or that you guys are talking about that you think will help? I mean, obviously we have bold goals and we have
Mhm.
some tools in place, but not enough, right? So recognizing you're talking a lot about community activists here. So I'm curious if there's something you have in the works or something you'd maybe not totally on this call, but like to hear more about from people sort of on the ground trying to do the work.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, as I'm sure everybody here knows, this current session, we took action on two major climate bills. So there was the Next Generation Roadmap, which technically became law last year because Governor Baker vetoed it, and we ran out of time to override it. Um, and then this year, led by Senator Mike Barrett on the House side, Representative Jeff Roy, we passed the Enact Driving, Clean Energy and Offshore Wind, which included the all electric communities pilot program, which was a bill that I I filed. So those are two major laws, and I think now I think there's a lot of excitement about the next administration, and I just think there's still so much more work to be done on climate. So in terms of just for reference about what's being discussed, and Immaculate and I have been meeting with a lot of the uh, major climate or environmental organizations. There was the recent Boston Globe story about Wellesley, about the fact that EverSource was saying that they were going to have to do gas infrastructure to get Mass Saves money. So I think that's really led groups like Heat, obviously many others, to say, why are our utilities in charge of energy planning? So there should be a separate entity, I would argue a government entity, that's in charge of energy planning, and not, respectfully, utilities. So that is a bill, and some of this is kind of inside info. Is the Acadia Center is working with some legislators on what's known as the Respect Bill, that would create a division of energy transformation planning under DPU to do energy planning. So I think that's very significant, and we're going to need a lot of support because, of course, utilities will oppose that bill. Um, Hearing a lot about grid modernization is that it's just going to be harder and harder for us to put up more solar or geothermal offshore wind if the grid, isn't modernized and updated. So that's an area where I feel like we still need a lot more suggestions from people about how do we convince utility companies to modernize the grid. Some people talked about, is it providing certain incentives for the utilities to do that? So been hearing a lot about that in the past few months. Um, Related is just how slow the utilities are to connect to solar projects. I know, in Acton, Congregation Beth Elohim, they built, I think, what is now the largest solar array for a place of worship in the state. Very proud of that. But the delay, and I don't have to tell anyone here because my guess is a lot of people here also experience those delays. But, contacting EverSource to get that approved took many, many months. So is that, saying that there should be staff dedicated in EEA to work on this? Is this saying the utility companies, should be having more dedicated staff to that goal? Um, I'm sure a lot of people here paid attention yesterday to the Energy Facility Siting Board hearing on the proposed EverSource substation in East Boston, which very disappointingly was approved by a 7-1 vote. So there will be legislation to change the standard that the EFSB is looking at projects, including obviously still, some fossil fuel projects, as well as, is this something where Governor-elect Moore Healy can change the composition of the Energy Facility Siting Board, so they're not an automatic rubber stamp on whatever energy project is proposed to the EFSB. And of course, related to that is the DPU. Lots of frustration at the DPU really working contrary to what we're all trying to get done on climate. So I think it's fair to say, although I'm not 100% sure, but there will be an opportunity, I think, for a new DPU chair under the next administration. So who should that person be? I do think it's safe to say that will be a person much more aligned with our goals than the current chair. So that's a real opportunity. But also, do we need to sort of further change the standards for DPU about what they're looking at in terms of, regulating carbon emissions? So I think that's a big piece. Um,
Okay, I'm gonna
and
give you one more, Greg, and then, I mean, not Greg, Jamie, and then.
yeah,
Questions. Yeah,
yeah.
this is a lot of great stuff in the works. I'll give you one more, one more.
Yes. Yeah. So the other one, which is one I think really the climate community needs to be much more cognizant is, first of all, how are we making sure from an equity point of view that all of these incentives and programs are also benefiting working class people, low income people, and people of color, which I think is a real, sort of problem in the climate change movement of the lack of diversity. Um, Related to that is job training. Is what are we doing to make sure that people of color, people from working class backgrounds, low income backgrounds, are getting clean energy jobs. So is that the vocational schools? Is that more state programs? How do we make sure that there's an equity there? Not to mention, the equity around making sure that the fossil fuel plants, et cetera, are not being placed in EJ communities. So the equity piece, I think, is really critical. And I think we all have to talk more about it.
Great, terrific. So I'm going to take some liberty and combine a couple of questions. So Jennifer Nixon asked a question that was a little bit related to another question on privacy concerns. So so Greg, you can maybe start, and Jamie can chime in. You mentioned the heat bill, that HEAT is considering a bill on neighbor to neighbor, a comparison and more transparency about people's energy use. We have bills that OPower has done where, I can see with smiley faces how I do compared to my neighbor. So that's sort of already coming from the utility. So I'm curious, Greg, whether you think those things have actually worked, and Jamie, whether you think more granularity around, as opposed to just a smiley face, but the transparency you discussed with the neighbor to neighbor bill would trigger concerns around privacy. Like, that wasn't okay with me that you shared that level of detail about my actions. And Greg, you can comment just on this general piece about it. So maybe Greg first and then Jamie.
So yeah, I think that generally speaking, there's promise in kind of making norms about energy use and water use more visible, especially because they are finite resources that we as like a community have to like decide how to use, right? So it feels fair, and or it could be described as fair in one sense. But in terms of the norm feedback interventions that you described, which are part of the standard home energy reports that OPower and Oracle put out, those actually did come from psychological research initially that did the same study on a much smaller scale, working with SMUD in Sacramento, and then like scaling it up. And then eventually like Oracle's like, can we do this professionally, like every major city in the country? And they just like started kind of rolling it out in mass. The largest analyses of those show that like it doesn't cost much to like print and mail that letter. It doesn't have a huge impact just to see those two bar charts, but it kind of reliably gets you like a 1 or 2% reduction. There's kind of like a why not factor. Like it's not a hard intervention to carry out. You might as well do it. If you could find like 20 things that saved you 1 or 2%, you'd be like doing a great job kind of, right, at like moving the needle in a big way. So it definitely categorizes there. The hard thing with leveraging social norms isn't that it's not that they're like not powerful determinants of how people behave, but it's just that often you can't wield them very well, right? So like getting a letter in the mail that says like your neighbors use less than you, like might make you be like, oh, I guess I should reduce. But it's not like your friends, family, and loved ones all coming to you and being like, if you don't stop, we will leave you. Like you can't leverage social norms that much, right? It's really hard to do so in an intervention that a nonprofit or legislature could pull off. But it's important to think about how we can facilitate social movement so that we understand that people do care about these things, including people we care about. So anytime, and this is one more way to make a connection to some of the work that Jamie was talking about, which is that people also infer norms, not just from the interactions they have with people, but also from institutions. So one big example of this was years back when the Supreme Court ruled on gay marriage. people's perceptions, not just of what the Supreme Court thought, but like of what the nation thought, like changed by like 10% overnight, right? So like some institutions can be a strong signal of what the community thinks. So seeing institutions take action generally is a good way to kind of bolster people's sense that other people around me that I care about must care about this issue. For the transparency piece, it's nice to be able to know that information. And there's very similar things that are really important. So when I moved into Waltham, for instance, I was contemplating getting geothermal for the house. And like Massachusetts, you can look up like every geothermal install like in the state. And it's the only state where that's that transparent. And that made it so much easier for me to even like begin to wonder if I could do it. Ultimately, it turns out my lot is super tiny and I don't have the setbacks to put it anywhere, unfortunately. But my first concerns were more about like, could I even afford this, or do people in this town even do this? And like that information being available made it visible to me. So I knew that I wouldn't be crazy if I tried, right? So I think that that's like super essential. And it's probably pretty similar to what other people do. They're like, I don't know, this stuff's all complex. Do other people do it? Does it work out? Is like some of the most basic information you probably want to have. So I think usually making information more transparent is really important. I think you do want to be careful about how you phrase it. Shame as a tool is tricky. It can, if there's consensus behind what you're shaming people about, shame works pretty good. But if it doesn't feel like there's consensus yet about what you're shaming people about, then they will marginalize you. And it doesn't necessarily work. So that's kind of the trade-off with shame. But I think transparency and utility usage of finite resources could start to make people start to understand like, hey, we were in a drought, or some people like not doing their fair share. Like that feels like a reasonable question. And I think getting to a point where we feel like there's consensus about that would be really important.
Yeah, I'm happy to add to that. Is I think those are very helpful specific responses. Yeah, what would be the impact? But this is something that he which is just, I think, amazing organization is talked about, is that if it was much more readily available and transparent, the energy use of your neighbors, could that impact behavior? So that is being discussed. Yeah.
Yeah, it appears that Ellen has dropped off the call. So this is Nathan
Okay.
Scott. I'm the new executive director, and so just want to continue this conversation. Just to say, I think this is a really important conversations we're having, and so I'm going to go back and pull up a couple more of the questions that have come in through the chat. Here is one from Fred Davis, and Fred, do you want to just ask your chat? But I think it might be interesting to have you read it out or share it yourself.
Okay, thanks, Nathan. And I'm all about peer-to-peer and influence. And I had heard you speak before, Gregg, and I love everything you're teaching us now has already is being put to use. I want to report. So I'm asking a question that's coming from a slightly different angle. And maybe it's for you, maybe it's for the legislators on the call, and maybe it's for someone else. What should be the correct response to the misinformation and the disinformation and the politicization that has really polluted all our efforts? I guess the academic question is, and by the way, the UN has explicitly said that is our problem in the United States. They called us out among all nations in the world, that this is our problem with climate. And I guess what I'm asking is, academically, can you see that we are any different? It would seem to me that this would go a long way to explaining, in other words, our self-doubt. Our self-doubt seems to be somewhat fairly deeply connected to the purposeful misinformation that's been polluting this arena for a long time.
So there are researchers who specialize in misinformation and how to combat it. And so some of those, for instance, some of the best techniques that they highlight are things like inoculating people to the misinformation. So like letting people know, like, you might hear this factoid being shared turns out it's not true, and like letting them know in advance about that. So that's one approach that seems promising. Another one is something called a poison parasite approach, where let's say there's like an attack ad, and you know that attack ad is going to be aired like 10 times more than you can afford to air your ad that countervails it. If you can parrot the attack ad and then just point out what's wrong with it, like in your ad, then every time they see the original, they'll think about your counter arguments instead. And so you're sort of hijacking their airtime by doing that. So that's another approach if you think you're going to be outspent by a louder adversary in like public discourse space. And then the last one I'll share is that there was a study recently by a colleague of mine at Harvard who was looking at like, what is it that makes people think something's truly a fact versus not a fact? And like the biggest predictor of what made something feel like a fact to somebody is if they thought there was consensus belief behind it. So communicating which things there's consensus about, maybe scientific consensus or expert consensus, or maybe even public consensus about things, is really important in establishing which things are and are not facts.
So all good. Thank you very much. And I appreciate, and if anybody has a political answer to it, I'd love to hear it too. And maybe that's a different program, but I do think that it's time, maybe this next Massachusetts administration is ready to be loud and proud and consistent. The EU, in my view, EU is far ahead of us in this regard. Top-down, positive, consistent messaging, I think it's time. Hey, thank you.
There's also research showing that deplatforming people who spread misinformation works. So there's evidence to that effect too.
All right, I'm back from losing internet, but I lost access to some of the chat. Nathan, thanks for jumping in. I saw one question in there earlier that was interesting, which was, so if we're so concerned, right? Most of us are concerned. I think Cheryl had a question, is that stat about having seen in the news include news articles? And it does. So it was really striking that a minority of Americans say they've seen something about climate in the last week. For this group, that probably seems incomprehensible, right? That how can that be? What are you looking at for news that we're not looking at? So if there's all this concern, why isn't there more action? Is it that we're not talking about it, or is it hard to do? Is it all of those things? And paired with that is some questions about, a bunch of us are trying a lot of one-on-one kind of coaching, talking neighbor to neighbor, really to, sometimes the actions are complicated and hard, Jamie, even though we've got good incentives, there's still, it's a new thing. It's hard to make a new choice. So I'm just curious how we reconcile this concern with the lack, while there's concern and support for policy, there isn't enough action. Are we just at the beginning of a tipping point, or is this gap going to just stay with us unless we do something differently? And I think, Steve, that may relate to your question about the inversion, which I've lost access to. So I don't know if this relates to that.
Sure. Well, I guess I would say, I think the state has taken bold action, right? Especially this session. So, I would say, if anything, after Next Generation Roadmap, I kind of assumed that this session, again, the same session, that we would not be doing, another climate law, but we did, and, for the most part, I've heard positive feedback, and already, the meetings that Immaculate and I have had, and other legislators are gearing up for, a whole host of other bills. So I would say, at least for Massachusetts state government, I feel like we are taking strong action, but there's just so many inequities based in the system. We have such a fossil fuel based state that more needs to be done. But I would like to think that we're being seen, hopefully, as taking bold action already. So
I think on the individual scale, that question looms large. Like if people care, and I think I saw in the question, like, why are people driving SUVs? Why are they doing all these actions that we know are bad for the environment if they supposedly care? So people are complex, right? They contain not always consistent feelings and attitudes and actions, and they have multiple pressures they're acting under at any given time. But even if that weren't true, even if it weren't the case that somebody thought like, well, SUVs are worse for the environment, I feel bad about that, but I want to have a quote unquote safe car for my family. which by the way feels like very much a norms issue, because the more that other people have SUVs, the more that your small car feels not safe anymore, right? Like there's like a kind of collapse of that system if everyone's driving huge monster vehicles, right? So even if that weren't the case though, and people were, it wasn't because they had multiple concerns that they're juggling. It's also the case that like people's intentions don't just translate into action. There's actually a lot of work you have to do in between, like, I agree with you and I'm willing to do something. And that work is not trivial. It's translational. And so what that means is that you have to help people with some of the most basic things that they underestimate are barriers. So like, when are you going to do it? What day? What time? How are you going to get there? Like these small things end up being pretty big in terms of determining if someone actually follows through or not with something. Like the concrete details matter a lot. And organizations, policy, and other things can do two things to facilitate. One, they can avoid creating more hurdles for any of the good things they want people to do and just make it like stupid easy to do them, right? So that's super important. And the other is that they can go above and beyond to even just facilitate it so it's like the default for a lot of things, right? So those two actions generally will get people to change quite a bit. Defaults on home energy consumption for whether you have like a renewable energy plan or not tend to be very effective. Like if you just like default a whole city, like 70% of people will just accept whatever default you give them, for instance, even if there's like a 10% change in cost, for instance. Like most people are like, sure, whatever. And so there's a lot of ways in which getting people to change has a lot more to do with like I said, making it kind of stupid easy and removing any and all barriers so that they're just like immediately channeled towards the good thing. And the other reason that change doesn't happen overnight, even though people might be motivated or agree, deals with just that they, as I mentioned before, they might personally like to do it, but be worried that others aren't, right? And so there's a lot of concerns in that neighborhood that we kind of already talked about. I definitely think that's part of the explanation, in addition to the translational component.
Nathan?
Yeah, so Jamie, I've got a question that relates to Gregg's work, which is Gregg spoke about the inversion between people's perception and reality. I'm interested in how that applies at the legislative level among legislators. If you as legislators knew that there was a great deal more support than you actually think there was, would there be a lot more support? And do you feel like legislatures are more cautious than they need to be, should be, in supporting climate change, and could that be changed if they were more aware that their constituents were more actively supportive?
Yeah, great question. I mean, I really think that revolution has happened, over the past 4 or 5 years, is that because of the climate groups, whether at the state level or local, have been so vocal and been so successful in reaching legislators, even those that may privately, not care that much about climate or not be at their priority list, are pushing and advocating and voting for this legislation. And that's why you're seeing legislation passing. So I think that has already been successful. And again, just the fact that the past few months, it's already been climate groups gearing up with some of the ideas, I talked about earlier to take action. So I personally feel that the legislature is very in tune with, being responsive and wanting to take action. Absolutely.
I didn't present it today. There's a data set that we have that I'm writing up for publication now, so it's not officially out yet, but we managed to sample both a sample of Americans with a set of questions and their attitudes about them and the environments. And we asked them their perception of fellow Americans like we did in the prior survey. And then we also managed to get a sample of local level decision makers of like 500 across the United States who were city and municipal policymakers. And we had them estimate what Americans thought too. And so we could actually like triangulate between all those points a little bit. So this is not about Massachusetts specifically or people you work with, Jamie, or anything like that. But in that data set, we find that similarly, we asked people like, what it will take to address climate change in broad strokes. Like it'll take both behavior and policy, for instance, as like a broad belief. And like 75 or closer to 80% of Americans agree with that. So that's going to take both. But they only think maybe like 50% of Americans feel that way. And then when we ask politicians, the decision maker sample, what they think, they also think it's only 50%. So like both the policymakers in our sample, at least, and the public share the same perception of the country, which is skewed a little bit towards being less concerned than it truly is. So it seems like whatever is kind of captaining our imagination about the country is like we're all kind of feeding from the same like funnel kind of what that picture is, and that picture is not very accurate probably.
So perhaps in addition to our mandate to talk to each other about climate change, we need to be talking to our legislators about climate change.
Definitely.
Yeah. So I know we're just about at the end of the hour, so I'll ask one last quick question and then hand it over to Nathan to wrap up. So Jamie, there are a couple of questions in the chat here from Susan and from folks in Acton, which I know you'd appreciate, saying like, we did fund a bunch of new stuff out of the Mass Save program, but some of the stuff, particularly around renters and property owner and landlords, does require landlords to agree to do it. And we're definitely seeing some hesitancy on that. So, and will this Mass Save program really get to where we need to go? So I think the question I want to ask is lots of good intention with the Mass Save program. It probably won't work exactly as envisioned with the new incentives. So how do you see us being able to give feedback to the program and to the legislature saying, you tried to make these things happen, here's where they're not working, and groups like all of us that are working at the local level being able to feed that information back to Mass Save and back to, and be taken seriously, like this is where it's not stupid easy, Gregg, to use your paraphrasing there. So I'm curious, Jamie, it's sort of how do we get mid-course corrections, because nothing works exactly as we want the first time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And I think sort of to the critique around energy planning, you know, one of the other ideas that I don't think I mentioned, but is I think will be advocated is actually to say, why are the utility companies in charge of Mass Save? You know, can the Mass Save program, can all that money be, say, put under DOER, and then DOER with the public mission, greater accountability, greater ability for the public, for legislators, you know, obviously the governor to influence DOER. So is that partly how to address that, not to mention, you know, all the equity considerations, including, you know, obviously making sure that renters benefit just as much as homeowners from Mass Saves or other energy programs. So I think that's the sort of bold suggestion, because I think there's a feeling that at the end of the day, utility companies, you know, are looking at their bottom line and their profit motive, and that's why, you know, arguably the programs are still not very robust. So
Okay, Gregg, I'll give you a sentence or two if you have anything to add, and then turn it over to Nathan to wrap us up. Or
I don't have any specific recommendations, but I would say, like, you know, if you want social scientists involved, we're happy to be.
Mm.
All right, Nathan.
Great. Well, thank you, Gregg. Thank you, Jamie. Really have appreciated your time and your wisdom, your thoughts, your experience, and giving us a picture of kind of how things look from where you stand. And I want to thank everybody who has come out tonight. Granted, you know, you fortunately haven't had to brave the wind and the rain, but thank you all for participating, for coming, for sharing this evening with us. And I do want to remind you that we are a nonprofit. You know, you've heard a little bit about the work we're doing. We would love your active and continued support. Many of you have given, have donated generously, and I want to thank you for that. Those of you who have, I'd love you to consider supporting MassEnergize and the work we're doing. So I'll have somebody put in the chat our donate, kind of a link to our donate button. If you'd be able and willing to make a donation, we'd love that. But we thank you for all the work you're doing regardless. As we all know, it takes, all of our efforts to address this. And I know that each and every one of you are doing things. So thank you again. And thank you for joining us this evening. We will be sending out some messages after this, some follow-up resources for those of you who have registered, so stay posted for that. But again, thank you all for taking the time to join us this evening.
Thank you very much.